Montana Territory, April 1883. Quinlan Pierce was halfway through repairing the fence along his north pasture when the stagecoach rolled in, 4 horses kicking up dust, the driver hollering to slow them down, and a single figure stepping out before the wheels had stopped fully turning. A woman. Alone. She wore a faded blue traveling dress, the hem thick with dust, and clutched a battered carpetbag with both hands like it was the only thing left in the world she trusted. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, hair pinned back but unraveling, and her eyes searched the flat stretch of land around his homestead with a kind of desperate hope. Quinlan dropped his hammer, wiped his hands on his shirt, and walked toward her. "You Pierce?" she asked, voice dry but steady. "I am," he said, stopping just short of her. "And you are?" "Julietta Whitlow. I'm your bride." Quinlan stared at her, stunned. "I did not send for a bride." "I know," she said quickly. "But someone did. Using your name." She pulled a folded letter from her coat pocket and handed it to him. The handwriting was his, but the words were not. It was a letter asking her to come west. Promising safety. A new life. A marriage. "I never wrote this," he said, voice low. "Where did you get it?" Julietta's eyes darted to the road behind her. "I have been on the run for weeks. I answered a mail order ad back in Missouri. I thought it was real. But the men who placed it, they were not looking for a wife." Quinlan's jaw tightened. "Who were they?" "Outlaws. I saw them rob a freight train outside of Independence. I was working as a telegraph clerk. I recognized one of them that same night when he came in to send a telegram. They figured out I knew. I ran. You came here hoping I was real. I did not have anywhere else left to go. The stagecoach had long since rattled off down the road. There was no one else in sight but the wind curling through the dry grass." "How many men are after you?" Quinlan asked. 3. Maybe 4. They tracked me through Kansas, Colorado. I paid good folks to hide me, but they always found me again. I got here early. Took a different route than the stage routes. But they will come." Quinlan looked at her, dusty, frightened, but still standing proud, and saw the truth in her eyes. She was hunted. And someone had used his name to trap her. "You look like hell," he said plainly. "I feel worse." He reached for her bag. "Come on. You cannot stand out here. If they are close, they might already be watching." Julietta hesitated, but then handed it over and followed him toward the house. Her steps were stiff, like she had not rested in days. The house was small, built from pine and stone, but solid. He had built it himself after the war. There was only one bedroom, which made things complicated. He gestured for her to sit by the hearth, poured her a cup of water, and set it in front of her. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "I will take the barn. I am not here to trap you into something," she said quietly. "I just need time. A place to breathe. I will leave in the morning. You are not going anywhere if men are tailing you." She looked up. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Quinlan leaned on the table and held her gaze. "Because someone used my name to try and ruin you." "That makes this my problem." Julietta did not speak for a long time. She just looked down at her hands, thin and scraped raw around the knuckles. That night, Quinlan dragged a bedroll out to the barn. He did not sleep much. He kept his rifle close and every few hours stepped outside to watch the horizon. The moon was high and cold. Coyotes howled somewhere far off. By morning, the fence was still down, but Julietta had swept his floor and boiled water for coffee. Her eyes looked clearer. She wore her same dress but had washed the dirt from her face and braided her hair. "I can help you with your work," she said, without waiting for an invitation. "I clean houses back in Missouri. I know how to cook too. You do not owe me anything. I do not like being useless." So he let her follow him down to the pasture. She carried wire and handed him nails while he hammered. She asked about the land, about the cattle, about why he stayed out here alone. He told her he came west after the war, after losing 2 brothers and any reason to go back east. Said the silence out here suited him. And she listened. Quiet but sure. Like she needed to know how he had survived. That night, she cooked beans and cornbread. He watched her move around his kitchen like she had known it all her life. 2 more days passed. They fell into a rhythm, working by day, keeping low at night. Quinlan kept his rifle close. Julietta slept on the cot in the corner. On the 3rd morning, just as the sun rose pink over the ridge, he saw dust on the trail. 4 riders. He turned from the window. Julietta! Get under the floorboards. Now. She obeyed without question, lifting the rug and slipping beneath the hidden hatch he had shown her the first night. The wood closed above her, silent. The riders came hard and fast. One of them banged on the door. Looking for a woman, the man said. 5'5", dark hair, blue dress. You seen anyone? Quinlan leaned against the doorframe, calm. No woman's come through here. The outlaw's eyes were sharp. You live here alone? I do. Mind if we look around? I do mind. The man glared at him. But Quinlan was taller, broader, and had his Winchester in plain sight. The man spat in the dirt. If you see her, you tell her we are coming. And we will not be as polite next time. Quinlan watched them ride off, waited until they were out of sight, and then opened the floor. Julietta climbed out, shaking. They are close now, she whispered. They will not stop. Then neither will I, Quinlan said. You are staying. I will keep you safe. She stared at him, tears in her eyes. Why would you risk yourself for me? He stepped closer. Because I believe you. Because you are not a burden. And because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as a stranger. Julietta's breath caught. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. Neither of them let go. By late spring, the high grass around Quinlan's homestead had turned a deeper green, and the river that cut through the lower edge of his land ran faster with snow melt. The riders hadn't returned, but neither of them pretended it was over. Julietta had stopped flinching at every creak of the windmill, though her eyes still flicked toward the ridgeline each morning when she stepped outside to gather eggs. She'd taken over the henhouse without asking, and Quinlan hadn't told her no. It was evening when he found her kneeling in the garden plot behind the house, sleeves rolled past her elbows, dirt under her nails. She was pressing seeds into the soil in neat rows, lips moving soundlessly as she worked. You don't have to do all that, he said, leaning against the fence post. I know, she replied, brushing a strand of hair away with the back of her wrist. But I like knowing something's going to grow. He crouched beside her, watching her thumb another seed into the ground. You always talk to the dirt? Just the seeds. I figure if I speak to them kindly, they might try harder. He smiled, but said nothing. She looked up at him, her face warm with the sun still clinging to the horizon. Did you have a garden before? He asked. No. But my mother did, back in Kentucky. She used to say the ground remembers who treats it gentle. He let the silence settle a while, watching the edge of her profile as she smoothed the soil over the last row. A breeze carried the scent of river willow and sage. Somewhere, a mourning dove called. I sent word to Sheriff Hanley in Miles City, he said finally. Told him 4 men posing as bounty hunters were riding under false names. Gave him the description you gave me. She sat back on her heels. You think he'll do anything? If they come into his jurisdiction, he'll hold them. He owes me for pulling his brother out of the Yellowstone when the ice broke 3 winters back. Julietta's gaze shifted toward the west, where the last of the light was bleeding out behind the hills. What happens if they ride in before he gets word? I reinforced the door, he said. And I've set a trip line along the south fence. If they come close, I'll know it. You always this prepared? No. But I've never had someone here worth protecting before. She blinked once, slowly, then nodded and stood. I made stew. If you don't say something bad about it, I'll let you have seconds. They ate by lamplight. Her cooking was different from his, less salt, more thyme, but he didn't mention it. Afterward, she sat near the hearth and mended a tear in his work shirt, while he checked the rifle's chamber and cleaned the barrel. "Did you ever think about it?" she asked. "Marriage." He looked up from the rifle. "I used to. When I was younger." "What changed?" "Buried too many people. Started thinking maybe I was better on my own." She nodded, threading her needle again. "I thought I'd marry a man from the depot. One of the clerks. He had soft hands and a quiet voice. But he wouldn't look me in the eye when I told him what I'd seen. Just said I ought to keep my mouth shut. Then he wasn't worth your time. I figured that out too late." The fire crackled between them. She tied off the last stitch and folded the shirt. "I don't expect anything from you," she said. "Not for taking me in. Not for keeping me safe. I know that. But if you ever did ask," she continued, eyes steady on his, "I wouldn't run." He set the rifle aside. His voice was low, steady. "You've been here only weeks. You've been looking behind your shoulder every day. That's no ground to start something on. I'm not asking you to start anything. I'm telling you I'd stay." He crossed the room to her, slow and sure. She looked up at him, not flinching, not retreating. He reached down and touched her hand, the same one that had steadied a shovel, stirred a pot, and now rested quiet in her lap. "I don't want you to stay because you're afraid," he said. "I want you to stay because you feel something here." "I do," she said. "That's why I'm saying it." He nodded once, then turned and banked the fire. No more words passed between them that night, but she didn't hide the way her eyes followed him as he moved through the room, and he didn't hide the fact that he felt it. The next morning, the trip line snapped. The snap of the trip line was sharp and clean, like a branch giving under weight. Quinlan dropped the bridle he'd been oiling and crossed the yard in 5 long strides, stopping beneath the cottonwood where the wire had been strung low between 2 fence posts. The wire lay slack in the trampled grass. A single boot print, heavy and fresh, pressed into the soft earth beside it. He didn't call for Julietta. She would have heard it too. She stepped from the house already wearing his old canvas coat, one hand hidden inside it. Her gaze swept past him to the boot print, then to the tree line beyond. "They're close," she said. "They're here." He gestured toward the barn. "Go. Through the loft. Use the ladder on the back wall, not the front." She didn't argue. Quinlan moved to the porch, picked up the rifle leaning against the door jamb, and stepped inside long enough to grab 3 cartridges from the shelf above the stove. He loaded them as he walked, eyes fixed on the low rise to the east. By the time he reached the edge of the clearing, Julietta was gone from sight. Wind cut through the grass in slow, fitful gusts. No horses. No voices. Just the hush before something breaks. He crouched low behind the fallen cottonwood that marked the edge of his grazing land. 30 yards out, a flicker of movement, a man in a stained black duster ducking behind a boulder, rifle slung low. Another to the west, taking up a flanking position. They weren't charging in. They were circling. He counted 3 shapes, maybe a 4th still out of view. Quinlan stayed still, breath shallow. Dust bit into his throat. The men were patient, too patient for amateurs. They weren't here to make noise. They were here to finish something. Behind him, a soft rustle in the grass. He turned, rifle half raised, but lowered it again when he saw Julietta crouched beside the chicken coop, eyes fixed in the same direction as his. "I told you to stay in the barn," he said, voice low. "I saw one heading that way. I couldn't stay there blind. You have a gun?" She pulled his old Colt from the coat pocket. 6 bullets. I counted. Quinlan nodded once. "Keep low. If they come around the coop, fire once and then move. Don't wait." She didn't blink. Just gripped the pistol tighter and settled into the dirt, calm as stone. The next hour passed in slow increments, shadows shifting, birds falling silent, the sun dragging west. Quinlan stayed behind the log, watching for the moment they'd move, knowing they wouldn't wait for dark. It came sudden, sharp, and quiet. A rifle cracked from the bluff, splintering bark inches from his shoulder. He rolled and returned fire, dropping flat behind the log as a second shot missed high. Julietta's pistol barked once near the coop. A man shouted. Then silence again. Quinlan shifted position, drawing their fire, counting shots. They were closing in now, pressing from both sides. He fired twice more and ducked low, then heard the scrape of boots behind the smokehouse. He turned and caught a glimpse of the fourth man, shorter, wiry, scarred down the cheek. Quinlan fired before the man could level his revolver. The outlaw dropped without a sound. Julietta ran from the coop to the barn while the rest were pinned. She moved fast, not reckless, and vanished inside. Quinlan pushed forward, flanking left, catching one of the men as he tried to reposition. The last two fled, one limping, the other dragging his rifle behind him, retreating into the trees. He didn't chase. When it was finished, the yard was quiet again. The wind returned, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and dry grass. One man lay still by the smokehouse. Another bled out under the east fence, rifle useless beside him. Julietta stepped from the barn, pistol still in hand. "Two ran," he said. "I saw." He crossed to her, took the gun gently, and set it aside. Her hands were shaking now, but she didn't step back. "You hit one?" "I think so." "I didn't wait to check." He reached up, brushing a smear of dirt from her cheek with the back of his fingers. "You did exactly right." "I thought I'd freeze," she whispered. "But I didn't." "You didn't." They stood in silence while the sun dipped behind the ridge and the sky turned the color of ash. That evening, Quinlan hitched the wagon and hauled the bodies into town. Julietta stayed behind, rifle across her lap, eyes on the tree line. He didn't ask if she'd be afraid alone. She didn't ask if he'd come back. When he returned near midnight, she had built up the fire and set 2 plates at the table, though the food had gone cold. He stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and hung his hat on the peg. "They were the ones," he said. "Sheriff's sending word to the neighboring counties. There's no bounty, but they'll be listed." She nodded once, then looked down at the table. "You should eat," she said. "It'll help." He sat across from her. The quiet between them was different now, less cautious, more settled. "They won't stop," she said softly. "Even if those 2 don't come back, someone else might. I'll bring that trouble with me wherever I go." "You're not going anywhere," he said. "I don't want you to." She looked up sharply. "You mean that?" "I do." He reached across the table and took her hand, rough palm to rougher fingers. "I want you here, Julietta. Not because someone hurt you. Not because I feel sorry for you. I want you here because I've never had someone look me in the eye and stay." Her voice cracked just a little. "Then I'll stay." He stood and reached for her, and she let herself be held solid and warm, like the wind had finally gone still. Either of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The wind shifted in late June, bringing with it the dry tang of pine smoke from some far-off fire and the whisper of high summer. The land had taken on a deeper hue, sun-browned and brittle at the edges. Quinlan moved slower in the heat, but his eyes missed nothing. Neither did Julietta's. She had taken to rising before the light, walking the perimeter of the homestead with his second rifle slung across her shoulder. Not out of fear anymore, but habit. Her steps were sure now, her gaze steady. When she returned, she'd wash her hands in the basin outside and check the sourdough starter she'd coaxed into life 3 weeks earlier. That morning, she found Quinlan sitting on the cabin steps, sharpening his skinning knife. He paused when she approached and studied the faint line of sweat at her temple. "There's a doe down near the creek," she said. "Drinking slow. Looks like she's nursing." He nodded once. "I'll leave her be." Julietta sat beside him, resting her boots on the packed dirt. "I think we've seen the last of them." He set the blade aside and looked out toward the hills. "You ever think about going back east?" I did, she said. But it'd feel like stepping into a life that doesn't know me anymore. He leaned back on his hands. What would you want, if you could have anything? I want something I build with my own hands. Something no one can take. He turned his face toward hers. Have you ever thought about staying in this house, not as a guest? She didn't answer right away. The sun was climbing, casting a sharp line of warmth across the porch. I thought about putting shelves in that empty wall by the stove, she said. And curtains that actually match. That sounds like you already decided. I did. He reached for her hand, calloused and warm from her morning walk. I was thinking about planting more oats. If we're going to winter too, we'll need more than I've ever kept. Her fingers curled into his. 2? I've lived alone a long time, Julietta. But I'm ready to make room. She looked at him, her mouth softening. Then I'm ready to stay. Later that week, they rode into Miles City. Quinlan shaved and wore the black coat he kept folded in oilcloth beneath the bed. Julietta tied her hair back with a strip of muslin and wore a dress she'd mended seam by seam herself. They stood before the justice of the peace with hands clasped, the summer wind blowing through the open window and lifting the edge of the marriage ledger. It was not a grand wedding. No guests, no lace, no music. Only two people who had come through fire and wind and blood, and chosen each other anyway. That night, back at the homestead, Quinlan lit the lamp and set it on the table. Julietta was already barefoot, her hem trailing the floor as she unpinned her hair. She moved through the room with familiarity, now his home no longer a place she'd come to escape, but one she'd chosen to belong to. He came to her slowly, stopping just before her, not touching yet. I've never done this before, he said. Not like this. She looked up at him. Neither have I. He placed his palm against her cheek, and she leaned into it without hesitation. The night passed quiet and long, stars thick outside the window, the hum of crickets rising and falling like a steady breath. In the weeks that followed, they worked side by side. Julietta took to spinning wool from the neighbor's sheep, her fingers nimble and patient. Quinlan built her a loom from cedar. She began keeping account of supplies, writing careful notes in the ledger with the stub of a pencil. They didn't speak often of what had come before. The past was a road behind them, still visible in the rearward glance, but no longer defining the direction they walked. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the world softened to amber, Quinlan returned from the creek with a string of trout. Julietta was outside, tacking oilcloth over the new shelves she'd painted blue. He held out the fish. Enough for two? She smiled. Always. He watched her a moment longer, the way the wind caught the edge of her dress, the way her hands moved with purpose. There was no longer any trace of the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach with dust in her hair and nowhere to run. And the man who once prized silence above all else now reached for her each night like she was the anchor keeping him steady. They would not leave this place. Not for fear, not for memory. They had carved something real from the hard edge of the frontier. And every morning, when the sun rose over the ridge and lit the face of the cabin, it found them there together, steady, no longer waiting for peace, but living inside it. A river fog settled low across the valley the morning Quinlan walked the ridge, sketching fence lines in his head. The land had held through spring's thaw, and the cattle were ranging healthy, but he kept an eye on every gully that might flood come next melt. He paused beneath a wind-warped juniper, fingers brushing the bark, and listened to the hush of water far below. Behind him, faint on the path, he heard Julietta's boots. You forgot your hat, she said, offering it out. He took it. You always walk this far just to hand me something? She shrugged. The house was too quiet. Thought you might want company. He didn't answer right away. She stepped beside him, arms crossed against the breeze, gaze following the long fall of the land toward the bend in the creek. I was thinking, she said after a time, we could fix up that little outbuilding near the west fence. It's still sound under the moss. He turned to her. What for? Maybe a place for the loom. Or a still room. I've been drying pennyroyal and wild mint could use space to keep the jars off your shelves. He studied her a moment. You want to stay in that long? She smiled, not coy, just sure. I already have. They walked back slow, the long way, cutting across the higher ridge where the soil ran thin and the wind moved through the grass in long, even breaths. When they reached the house, Julietta peeled off toward the well, where a bucket had frozen the night before. Quinlan ducked into the barn to check on the calf born just after the last frost, still shaky on its legs but growing stronger. That evening, as she poured water into the basin and wrung out her apron, Julietta asked without looking up, "Did you ever think about having children?" He set down the ledger he'd been reading. "Not for a long time. Thought I wasn't built for it." "You aren't," she said, lifting her eyes to his. "But you're built for raising them." He blinked at that, then leaned forward in his chair. "You already thinking that far ahead?" "I've been thinking since the morning I caught you wrapping that colt's leg with an old flannel like it was a cradle band." He gave a low laugh, then sobered. "You sure you'd want to raise a child here? Miles from town, winters long? I'd rather raise one here than anywhere else I've known." They didn't speak of it again that night, but the next afternoon Julietta brought home a bundle of linen from the general store. Said she needed it for new pillow slips, but her hands lingered on the cloth longer than they needed to. The days stretched out warm and slow. Quinlan replaced the sagging porch rail, and Julietta planted squash in neat mounds beside the house. They visited town once a month for salt, nails, and news. The sheriff gave word that the 2 outlaws who'd fled had been sighted east of the Dakotas, caught passing counterfeit bills. Neither showed interest in returning west. Summer crested and rolled into fall. The wind turned sharper, and Julietta began wearing her shawl indoors. Some mornings she didn't rise as early. Quinlan noticed, but said nothing until one morning he found her standing at the hearth, one hand resting low on her belly. She turned when he entered, and the look she gave him was quiet, certain. "I'm carrying," she said. He crossed the room in 2 steps and pressed his hand over hers. "Are you well?" "I'm tired. But I'm well." He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her and held her against his chest, her heartbeat steady beneath his own. When the first snow fell, Quinlan built a cradle from pine and lined it with wool. Julietta sewed a quilt small enough to tuck over a newborn's legs. Neither of them said aloud what they were thinking, but each night, they found each other's hands in the dark, holding on even through sleep. The birth came in early March, when the wind howled against the windows and the sky stayed low and gray. Quinlan boiled water, kept the fire fed, and did everything the midwife from Miles City told him to do. Julietta labored long, jaw clenched, hands gripping the edge of the bedpost. When the child finally came, she was red-faced and strong-lunged, her cry slicing through the cabin like a bell. "A girl," the midwife said, wrapping her in linen. Julietta reached for her with shaking arms. Quinlan stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other brushing the downy crown of the baby's head. "She looks like you," Julietta whispered. Quinlan kissed her hair. "She looks like she's got your fight." They named her Eliza, after Julietta's mother. That spring, the land greened early, and the creek ran full but gentle. Quinlan built the outbuilding into a proper workroom, with shelves for herbs and a window that caught the morning light. Julietta took to sitting there with Eliza swaddled against her chest, weaving in the lull between feedings. One morning, Quinlan led the 2 milk cows out to graze, turned back toward the house, and caught sight of Julietta standing in the doorway, Eliza in her arms, the wind pulling a curl loose from her braid. She waved once, small and slow. He lifted a hand in return and felt something in his chest settle, like a gate swinging shut on a long, empty road. They didn't speak much of the days before. They didn't need to. Everything they'd lost had shaped what they'd found, a life tucked into a quiet corner of Montana, stitched together with work and warmth and a love that asked for nothing more than to be lived daily, without fear. Inside the house, on a shelf above the hearth, sat a worn piece of blue muslin and a scrap of paper with Quinlan's name written in a stranger's hand. Julietta hadn't asked him to burn it. he hadn't offered. Some things were better kept as reminders not of danger, but of the road that led them home. Years later, when Eliza took her first steps in the grass behind the barn, Julietta called to her gently, and Quinlan set down his hammer and came to watch. The girl turned, laughing, and walked straight into his arms. That night, as the sun dipped behind the same ridge where Julietta had once handed him his forgotten hat, he stood on the porch with her hand in his and their daughter asleep inside. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come?" "I never wonder," she said. "Because I did." And he kissed her, slow and sure, the wind carrying the sound of the creek below steady, enduring, and soft against the land they'd made their own.